So the last snow review I put out was on the game Momodora Reverie Under the Moonlight, which you can check out in the link right here. A fantastic platformer that I don't feel I really did justice to. With that in mind, I set out to retroactively wipe away the disgrace of that previous video and give this game the in-depth look I feel it deserves. That being said, this time around, it's going to be more of an analysis than just a straight-up whether or not you should buy it review. I want to look at everything from the gameplay to the advertisements and so on. Which, yeah, the advertisements would probably be a great place to start. Though, don't get the wrong idea. This is all coming from myself, and as such, there are going to be a lot of opinions and possibly some errors, as I've done the best to check everything for facts and, accuracy, but I'm human. I could have missed something. But anyway, this is going to be chock full of spoilers, so you have been warned. Go play the game first before you watch this review.
Right away, the trailer for this game is pretty damn good. There are two specific elements to it that I want to make note of: the skill display and the use of the big titty anime girl. Now, when it comes to skill display, the trailer shows us some very important concepts of the game's combat. First, it shows us we can roll to avoid enemies, after which it shows us we can use the bow and arrow after a roll. Then the trailer goes to showcase a particular ability of the leaf, which is to repel attacks. Now, all of this may seem trivial, and you're probably watching this saying, well, duh, Mr. Snow, of course the trailer is going to show us stuff like gameplay, you plebe. But what this shows you, whether or not you notice it, is the skill curve to this game. You got rolls, you got items, you got distant attacks, you got melee attacks. You aren't aware of all the tools you get to play with, but you're aware of the potential that you can achieve playing this game. The second biggest aspect of the trailer is the boss fight against the boob monster. Now, I'll be the first to rant about how using sex to sell your product is incredibly lazy and reflects poorly on the developer, but in this situation I think it might have been the better move. The boss is only shown for a couple of seconds, but it does go to establish a sense of fan service in the game. I mean, the only hitbox to the fight is her giant, massive jugs. By doing this, it does get potential audiences tilting their gaze in the trailer's direction. Because really, if you put the game next to all the other anime games on Steam and it doesn't have a bit of fan service to show, I'd imagine no one would have given it a second glance. I mean, the game art we see on the store page looks like all the other frickin' $2 RPG Maker titles flooding the market. Point is, they had to do something, and I think this was the right move. Now let's go ahead and dive into the game proper. A picture, as you know, is worth 1,000 words. The picture we get at the opening is that of the priestess atop a ridge overlooking a darkened city. The city is very clearly a long way from the priestess, thus implying our destination. The darkness hanging over the city tells the audience this is or has become a place of evil, and the priestess's contrasting color scheme tells us she's the opposite. A pretty standard setup, granted, but it's techniques and little things like this that make it so much better than crap like digital homicide spams on the green light. Moving on to the file select screen, it goes farther to establish the setting of our story. The menu options are all in a sort of floral rustic aesthetic, which goes to set a time frame the story would take place, but not on its own. The effect piggybacks off the previous opening screen. We had a very Victorian-ish London design to the city. The almost regal-like carpeting backdrop on the menus helps let us soak in a relative time this story could take place. Does this actually take place in the heart of Victorian-era London? Most certainly not. But it ties itself to something we can identify in the real world, and thus we're able to understand the setting a lot better than we would otherwise. Okay, let's get to the actual bits of the game where you control the priestess. Our introductory level is a simple meadow where we get easy enemies to practice the game's mechanics. Immediately, the player knows they can be at ease and practice whatever they feel they are having trouble with in this area. Enemies are comical in appearance, ranging from pink blobs with clubs to little imp-like beings. The setting of the particular stage also goes to subconsciously tell the player it's okay as well. See, meadows like this have become popularized by the very first level in Super Mario Bros. Since then, there have been a multitude of other games that have utilized a grassy meadow as an opening level because we've come to associate it with the ease from those early NES Mario titles. Now, don't get me wrong, not all games do this. Certainly setting makes a huge difference. Like, you wouldn't have Mega Man X starting an adventure going through a grassy meadow killing gerbils, but it can work really well for certain titles like this one. This zone also subconsciously tells the player what we're fighting for. An NPC tells the player we're heading for the castle and the problems have started to spread into this meadow. The serenity of this opening is representative of how the world is supposed to be. We are told that darkness is spreading and this is the safest distance the NPC can take us. This right here, this is how we want things to be. peaceful. The enemies here, as mentioned, aren't at all difficult and allow the player to try out things they may have seen in the trailer, such as deflecting enemy attacks with a melee attack. The first enemy with a projectile throws a very large and very slow object that is easy to practice this mechanic on. We're also introduced to the blue switches that can be hit with our bow. The first one is a very obvious, hey player shoot it, as evidenced by the arrows sticking out of the wall to suggest the player tries this action. The blue switch is put to the test again when we need to complete a bit of an obstacle course to land a hit. It isn't particularly difficult, but it is more challenging than what we've had to do before. There are two bosses I'd like to highlight in this section. One is an overgrown pink blob and the other is an overgrown centipede. The pink blob is just a larger version of the enemies we've had no problem facing up to this point. This is another subtle tell to the player, it's okay guys, you got this. It fights in the same manner as well. This puts your understanding of the game's mechanics to its first, yet optional test, and the reward is an item that can grant more money from foes. The first real boss is a giant centipede with no hurt box. The player can run up and give it a big hug and take no damage. Remember folks, this is the first real boss, and as an introduction it works well. The fight goes to highlight a very important aspect of the game. Bosses will telegraph their attacks. A blinking white circle is the tell for enemy attacks. Not all of them, but by and large, boss battles will telegraph their attacks in the same way. This is your cue to dodge by rolling or creating distance. All of this comes after the meadow we've been traveling through slowly becomes more poison and hostile, which is representative of the spreading evil. After the boss, we come to the city of Karst. From here, the game gets serious and the difficulty ramps up. No longer are we facing childish imps, instead now we come across dark witches and flaming hellhounds. We come across a white barrier that tells us we need the crest to continue. At this point, the game opens up into its non-linear style, and as there is no set-in-stone path to take, I'll be discussing 5 of the other 6 areas in no real particular order. The first zone I'd like to cover is the Subterranean Grave. The area has a dungeon-like design to everything. The music is very dark and dreary and fitting of the creepy area the player finds themselves in. Enemies the player encounters are also styled around reapers and various other undead motifs. Here, like the other zones in the game, there isn't really a new mechanic introduced. The most notable thing I've found is a dungeon where a blue-headed NPC is asking for my help. Unfortunately, there isn't anything you can do for this NPC, and later in the game, if you come back, you'll find the character dead. There's another character that makes an appearance as well. This character comes to us and tells us a little bit more about what's been going on, but remains largely inconsequential. She shows up once more when we go to the Furore Ciel, but is largely forgettable. The next area I'll be talking about is the Cinder Chambers. This is basically the fire area of the game, and they oddly accomplish this without a lot of fire. This is accomplished by great use of color along with the smoke and drifting cinder effects decorating the screen. This paired with a couple of specific monsters in the area go on to create the illusion of a stereotypical fire dungeon without having to spam fire everywhere, though that could have opened up for some inventive platforming. Instead, the zone opts for more focus on traps. Sure, there are some enemies to run through, but by now hopefully you've gotten the hang of the roll mechanics and can by and large skip many of the smaller enemies. However, arrow traps and explosive barrels litter the landscape here, and the player needs to have a handle on their trigger finger to not inadvertently kill themselves. The boss fight in this area is another humanoid enemy, and we get help from an NPC we met earlier. Upon defeating this foe, we learn a little more about what's been going on, but nothing we didn't already know or already figure out. Next up is the Forlorn Monastery. The place is designed in the beginning as a giant church complete with nuns. The place borrows elements of its design from previous areas explored, namely Karst City. This really rubbed me the wrong way, as of all the places I got lost, this was where it happened most often. It doesn't look exactly like the house in Karst City, but it looks very similar. It's here the player runs into another forgettable NPC, which is the Cat Witch Lady. There's also a boss fight in the area against a woman in a white dress who accuses you of siding with the Queen. Needless to say, this character dies over a complete misunderstanding. You've probably noticed a trend where I haven't been naming characters. I'll elaborate on that later, but for now let's go ahead and leave the monastery, as there isn't much to talk about here other than hammering down points I've already made about competent level building and difficulty curves. Our next area is the Whiteleaf Memorial Park. The focus of this zone is aerial-based enemies and attacks. While overall it's just as well designed as other parts of the game, one thing that sticks out to me is the main entrance to the zone, which is blocked off by a wall after a save point. The player at this point only sees a small bit of area beyond the wall. This is a slight indication that there is content back there, but how do you reach it? The game expects the player to experiment, and by doing so come to the realization that certain walls can be magicked away with a melee attack. I'm not sure this was the best way to go about things. It's entirely possible for a player to get stuck here and have no idea on how to progress. What I would have done is make the breakable wall visibly different from the rest of the wall. Maybe add some cracks or have it be a different color. Heck, with the cracks idea, when the wall dissipates, it could shatter instead of just fading away. Either way, though, this not only opens the next zone, but it tells the player, hey, there's some hidden breakable walls in this game. Make sure you check that map of yours. The boss fight of this zone is a rematch with our favorite pair of big blue bouncing breasts. This fight plays like a more difficult version of the first fight. All of the old moves are still there with some extra hazards thrown in. This is everything a rematch should be in this type of scenario. My only complaint with it comes from what happens after the fight. The priestess is knocked unconscious by an explosion, and when we awaken, we're a cat. We're put in a cage, yet not disarmed as we still have our weapon. Then the dungeon leads us very clearly into a path where we can get an item to transform at will. There are two reasons why this bugs me. First, it seems like a massive oversight on the villains not to just kill me when they had the chance, and two, because I feel there could have been a really nifty puzzle idea here. Something where you free yourself from the cage and then have to get your gear back. Feels like one big missed opportunity. Once the player has access to the cat sphere, the player can get into the Furore Ciel. This zone is a small extension of the Sacred Meadow, and I do mean small. On repeat playthroughs where you know what you're doing and where to go, you can clear the zone in probably a minute and a half. Enemies are easy and generally slow moving with large hitboxes, and there isn't a boss to worry about. You just run in, grab your crest fragment. The aesthetic of the zone is some sort of distorted meadow. Honestly, I'm not sure what the devs were going for with this. Generally, when a player enters like a shadow or alternate world in a game, it's to show what the consequences are for failure. Link to the Past is a fantastic example of this. The Dark World is a representation of what will happen to Hyrule should Link fail. It's dark, twisted, people are miserable, and monsters roam the land unchecked. With Momodora, the world turns blue. If anything, this would defeat the tension, as blue is a very soothing color and associated with peace and pacifism. The second to final zone of the game is the Royal Pinacotheca. Without doubt, this is the hardest zone in the game. Enemies are at their most ghastly and hostile looking and can hack off damn near your entire life bar if you've not gained any extra life to this point. This is probably why you get a couple super easy to get a hold of health upgrades in this zone early on. I think the developer was very aware of how hard this can be and wanted to give the players a little something to help them out. The boss battle here is a two-pronged attack from a knight and an archer. The boss throws a bit of a curveball, arrows bounce off. Now, if you've been relying on the bow for more difficult encounters, that crutch has been ripped out from underneath you. On the flip side, this fight feels very standard by now if you've mastered the melee combat. The two phases mix things up a bit and are overall a nice change of pace compared to the two previous bosses. Finally, we come to the end of the game, Karst Castle. It's another zone focusing on the hardest enemies the boss can throw your way. However, at this point, the player has hopefully mastered the mechanics to the point they don't even need to fight the enemies anymore. Cat form can bob and weave through most baddies, and the dash will help you skip entire sections with the cat's increased mobility. So, all in all, this really isn't hard anymore. Before coming to the mini-boss of the zone, the player runs into another character we've met earlier who was on the brink of death. We can put her out of her misery, or not, and doing so yields the same results. I get the same item which restores HP. This is another missed opportunity for the game. This meaningless yes or no decision is of no consequence to the player at all. Couple that with how we barely knew this person, and it wasn't like the player was going to give a shit about the character's death. Great in theory, didn't really hold up in practice. The two final boss encounters are quite possibly the easiest fights in the game. First, we have this floating angel thing. She makes duplicates of herself, and the one to attack is the one throwing a blue flashing projectile. Like the previous boss discussed, this one is immune to arrows, so she can't be poisoned that way. However, you can still cheese this fight with the Backman patch, where you rain death, catching multiple copies at once and poisoning the one you need to hit. So while this fight does throw a curveball at the player, it still isn't really hard. This trend unfortunately continues with the last boss, which is the Queen of Karst. The Queen of Karst repeats the same attacks like the other enemies with large and fast-moving hurt boxes. She flies around, likes to strike beneath you, and will kill you in 2 or 3 solid hits. Design-wise, this is everything a well-made final boss should be. Unfortunately, it falls victim to the simple mechanics of the game. The Queen follows all the rules of the bosses before it, and as such, you haven't so much passed this test already so much as you're teaching the class by now. There's one surprise this boss throws at you, but it's another very telegraphed move. Granted, it has a very fast startup and can maybe kill you in one hit depending on how many health upgrades you've gotten, but the dodge mechanics make it cake to avoid. The game did too good of a job hammering its mechanics into the players, and even the third phase of the boss fight is something even a moderate level gamer can beat without taking any damage. The ending also leaves a lot to be desired. If you've gotten the upgraded weapon, you'll get the true ending, which is just removing the curse from the queen, and the priestess gets spirited away by doing so. that's basically it. We get no real conclusion and are made to assume Karst unfucks itself now. Couple that with the relatively little buildup and ease of the fight, this is a very underwhelming ending. In terms of mechanics and level design, the game is damn near a masterpiece. Everything is simple so it can be picked up quickly, yet the damage from enemies is a harsh punishment. As referenced earlier, this helps the player to learn how to get good at the game very fast, however this does cause later parts of the game to suffer from perceived diminished difficulty. In reality, the last parts are competently designed harder than when you're searching for the crests, but because your gameplay is so simplistic and minimal and easy to master, by this time you can run through with little challenge as the enemies all follow the same rules as one another regardless of damage output or other gimmick. With all bases covered, I'd like to go into what I feel is the weakest link in the game now. The characters. You've noticed I'm not using any of the characters' names by now. It's not for any attempt at a deep insight into any underlying theme, it's just the characters are almost entirely non-existent and I can never remember the names. For example, the Dying Knight I mentioned earlier has just a couple of lines prior to that and helped me out in a boss fight I cheesed with my bow and arrow. Not very impactful. And that's the trend for all the characters in the game. We meet them, they say one or two lines, and they disappear. None of them are interesting at all, and truthfully there isn't much they could have done about it. This is an action platformer, not a character-driven narrative experience. Characters are given to us as an excuse to go from point A to point B. The Cat Witch is the best example. She gives us a key and tells us some info. That's it. And that's all she needs to do. Unfortunately though, when we have a character randomly come back dying in front of us when we have nothing to really know them by, it just feels nonsensical. The developers should have never done that, instead just letting the NPC remain in whatever spot she was tethered to before. Still though, Momodora Reverie Under the Moonlight is a damn fine action platformer despite its shortcoming where it tries to do something with characters it really doesn't need to do. Anything negative I have to say about the game stems entirely from good things on the devs' part. The difficulty drop is a result of the devs doing their job too well, and the indifference to the characters largely comes from the genre of the game title. I only hope this video does the game justice and goes to convince some folks who might otherwise overlook this one to try it out.